Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we're continuing our 16th century exploration unit by talking about Juan Ponce de Leon. And Ponce de Leon was a Spanish explorer who I will explain a little bit later. I kind of equate to the General Custer of the 16th century. Ponce de Leon was born in Valladolid in 1474. And if you'll recall, that's the same city in which Bartolomé de las Casas would later have the infamous debate in. He was actually a member of Columbus's second voyage in 1493. So as a 19-year-old man, Ponce de Leon was already a participant in a major historical event. And as Christopher Columbus's star fell, he came under controversy. We all recall what occurred in the last unit. Ponce de Leon became more and more reputable in Hispaniola. He helped put down a native rebellion which occurred in the early 1500s. He helped explore the island of Puerto Rico in 1508 and was actually named the island's first governor in 1509. But we're not here to talk about Ponce de Leon's founding of Puerto Rico. We're here to talk about something that occurred a little bit later. Ponce de Leon was actually, unlike Columbus, someone who did have a good growth in wealth, and in the 15 teens, he faced a rival, a man by the name of Diego Columbus, who was the son of Christopher Columbus. It's not really clear in the rivalry what the difference of opinion was, but there was actually a court battle in Spain, and Ponce de Leon was ousted as governor of Puerto Rico as a result of that court battle. So like Columbus, Ponce de Leon faced immense political pressure and fallout and was removed from his political position as a result of that. Allies of Ponce de Leon encouraged him to continue exploring the Caribbean after he is ousted as governor because he doesn't, frankly, have anything else to do. And there were rumors of land further north and to the northwest of Puerto Rico, a land which we now know to be the lower 48 states. So in 1513, Ponce de Leon decides to lead this expedition northwest. Now, that is the topic of today's written resource, and that was written by Antonio de Herrera. He actually wrote it in 1601, so it was a little after Ponce de Leon's time, but it is considered by historians to be the most accepted version of events. And we'll find out a little later, Ponce de Leon, like some people in history, become more and more mythical in nature as time goes on. De Herrera's account starts rather plainly. Juan Ponce de Leon, finding himself without office and seeing himself rich, determined to do something by which to gain honor and increase his estate, and as he had news that there were lands to the northward, he resolved to go to explore that part, for which he armed 3 vessels. So the exploration consisted of 3 ships, and Ponce de Leon leaves on March 3rd, 1513. It's interesting to note that Ponce de Leon, as we heard from Herrera, was far better off than Christopher Columbus at the time of this voyage. On March 8th, they discover an island in the Bahamas, and over the next 3 days, they would go to 3 different islands, and on March 11th, they would settle on one of those islands for a period of 3 days for repairs. On March 14th, they reach the original island that Christopher Columbus landed on. And this was the island from Columbus's first voyage. I would encourage listeners to go back, if you haven't, to listen to that first episode where we cover Columbus's first voyage, because it's interesting here that the account mentions nothing of the native population. I do believe that by this time in 1513, sadly, the native population is gone from this island. We do know that eventually they were moved to slavery, and most of those people died, sadly. I think it's important at this point to talk about Columbus's writings and in that first voyage. When he does come upon this island at the very beginning of his travels in the Caribbean, and the natives on this island warn him that there are tribes to the north and northwest of them that come down and attack them and then go further south. We now know that Ponce de Leon is going to head northwest to where those natives are, and we'll have to see what happens. On April 2nd, Ponce de Leon arrives in what is present-day eastern Florida. Let's read. They ran along beside the coast, seeking harbor, and at night anchored near the land in 8 fathoms of water. And believing the land was an island, they named it La Florida, because it had a very beautiful view of many and cool woodlands, and it was level and uniform. La Florida. So that is how the name Florida came about. If you're ever on Jeopardy, there you go, you have the answer. Ponce de Leon continues to sail down the east coast, and he does this until the 20th of April, when they spot some native huts. They struggle to get ashore. Once they do, let's turn to the reading. Here Juan Ponce went ashore, called by the Indians, who immediately tried to take the boat, the oars, and the arms. In order not to break with them, they suffered, it not wanting to cause trouble in the land. But because they struck a seaman in the head with a stick, from which he remained unconscious, they had to fight with them. So the natives are apparently calling this group on shore, and immediately they try, essentially what they're saying, to take everything, to overtake them. And they actually struck a man in the head, knocking him out, and as a result, they had to fight each other. You can already see some of the things coming out in terms of behavior that Columbus was warned about when he landed on that first island 21 years prior. Ponce de Leon is not deterred, however. He continues down and around the Florida coastline. So he is going around the Panhandle. On the 15th of May, he passes along the Florida Keys. He comes around the Panhandle and heads up the western side of Florida, where on May 24th, he ends up at Charlotte Harbor. Ponce de Leon stays in Charlotte Harbor from May 24th through June 3rd. And on June 3rd, they encounter more natives, and these natives are in canoes. Let's see what happens. They took 4 women and broke up 2 old canoes. They traded skins and guanin. On Friday the 4th, while waiting wind to go in search of the chief Carlos, as the Indians on the ship said he had gold, a canoe came to the boats, and an Indian who understood the Spaniards said that they should wait, as the chief wished to send gold in order to trade. And while waiting there appeared at least 20 canoes, and some fastened together by twos. Some went to the anchors, others to the ships, and began to fight from their canoes. Not being able to raise the anchors, they tried to cut the cables. An armed bark was sent against them and made them flee and abandon some canoes. They took 5 and killed some Indians, and 4 were captured. So Ponce de Leon brings these 4 women on the ship, attempts to do trade. Interestingly, a native comes along who knows their language. This is interesting because in the early 16th century writings, this is really the first time, at least I can see, anybody from a native background approaching or being involved in anything that actually knows the Spanish language. He tricks the Spanish into sticking around, and this fight breaks out. The Spanish hold their ground, and what Ponce de Leon does, he does capture a few men. He sends 2 of those natives to the chief, who he refers to as Carlos. That's an interesting name considering it's a Spanish name. I think it was probably given to the chief by the Spanish. But he sends 2 natives to the chief in the hopes of negotiating trade. So there's still hope that the fighting will not continue, and this is what ends up happening. The Indians arrived and said that the next day the chief would come to trade, but it was a deception. Meanwhile, the people and canoes gathered together, and at 11, 80 men in breech clouts appeared on the ship that was nearest. They fought from the morning until the night without hurt to the Spaniards, because the arrows did not reach them, while on account of crossbows and artillery they dare not draw near. The Indians retired. So it sounds like they attempted an attack on the boat, but they couldn't get close enough for their arrows to get onto the boat that I'm sure they were firing, and there was artillery aboard this boat that they didn't want to get too close to for risk of being fired upon, so they ended up retreating. So they end up resuming their travels on June 14th, and on June 21st, they come upon an island where they end up taking 160 tortoises, 14 seals, and many pelicans. Presumably some for food source. I believe in the writings it did refer to the seals as a food source. On the 26th, they sighted land and decided to follow it, and they followed it for 3 days, and on the 29th, the following observations were made. The greater number considered it Cuba because they found canoes, dogs, cuttings from knives, and from iron tools, and not because anyone knew it was Cuba, but by the argument that for Cuba they took that course, and it ran east to west like it, except they found themselves 18 long leagues off the route for it to be Cuba. And what ended up happening here is Cuba ended up being a much longer island than people had thought, so they ended up further west on Cuba, and so Cuba is just a bigger space, and they ended up on the west side of the island, and they started working their way east. The reading goes on to discuss that the Spaniards, Ponce de Leon and his crew, really felt that Florida was an island much like Cuba. And if you think about it, they went around the bottom of Florida, probably thinking at some point they would go up to an end. It's interesting in their thinking because at the same time the natives talked about there existing a much larger mainland, which is what Florida was a part of. But the Spaniards thought this was a deception. On July 25th, Ponce de Leon and his crew arrives on the island of Bahama, and they stay until August 6th. The journal briefly mentions that Ponce de Leon in this journey is searching for a water spring. This water spring is a place where you can go, bathe in the water, perhaps drink it, and maintain your youthful appearance for life. This little spring, which is briefly mentioned in the writing, turns into the myth of the Fountain of Youth. And in later centuries, Ponce de Leon's legacy turns into it being this man that was looking for the Fountain of Youth, when in fact it was just a rumor he had heard. He looked for it on this island, didn't find it, and then decided to turn back for San Juan. And on his way back to San Juan, he stops at a few points along the way. He returns to Puerto Rico in October of 1513. So Ponce de Leon has given Florida its name, which turns out to be the oldest European name given for any part of the United States. So what does Ponce de Leon do with the information from this voyage? Well, he returns to Spain in 1514 and is knighted by King Ferdinand. Remember King Ferdinand from the Columbus unit? He was still alive in 1514. And King Ferdinand reinstates Ponce de Leon back as the governor of Puerto Rico. Interesting way to earn your job back. Ponce de Leon is then issued an extension of his patent that he received in 1512. The patent extends his colonization authority to Florida. So Ponce de Leon is now authorized by the Spanish crown to colonize Florida. He returns to Puerto Rico in the same year that he was in Spain, 1514, and he is asked prior to moving through with his colonization to put down an attack from the Carib canoemen. And if you'll recall from our Columbus unit, the Carib canoemen were an interesting group of natives. Let me just put it at that. And you can go back to episode 3 and learn more about the second voyage that Columbus was on. And Ponce de Leon was with him, so he would know, and what the Caribs were up to. Ponce de Leon, in his attempt to subdue the Carib rebellion, if you will, actually fails. He fails, he loses, and he goes back to San Juan defeated and decides to retire. Over the next few years, different events occur in Hispaniola. While Ponce de Leon is enjoying his retirement, he learns of different conquests and different things that he is doing. So as a result, he decides to come out of retirement and to take his patent and go back to Florida. On February 10th, 1521, Ponce de Leon sends a short letter to Emperor Charles V. So Ferdinand dies during the retirement. Charles I becomes the King of Spain, who then becomes Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Ponce de Leon sends him a letter and says he's leaving for Florida in a few days. The second voyage to Florida is recollected by Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo. And this was a man who was actually on the voyage, so he can account for what occurred. This fleet had 200 men and 50 horses. Let's turn to the writing. And it seemed to him that in addition to what could be learned and known of the islands, also on the mainland could be learned other secrets and important things, and that those people could be converted to God to the great profit of himself in particular, and in general for all those who were accompanying him. So despite the problems that Ponce de Leon faced in his first voyage to Florida, he's apparently of the opinion that it's going to be easy to convert these people to Christianity. Quickly, though, and I mean quickly, we learn that the situation is a little more difficult than anybody had imagined. Let's take a look. But the temperature of the region was very unsuitable and different from what he had imagined. And the natives of the land were a very austere and very savage and belligerent and fierce and untamed people, and not accustomed to a peaceful existence, nor to lay down their liberty so easily at the discretion or alien violation of other men. Whoa. So essentially these natives were difficult, and we should have learned that from the first trip. And if not then, we could have learned it from Columbus, who talked to the natives when he originally arrived. The writing goes on to describe priests having no effect on the changes of behavior or attitude by the natives toward the Spaniards, which I read the letter. It was very brief in terms of this description, but I would have loved to have heard how the priests tried to reason with these natives. Clearly, they didn't want the Spaniards there. Clearly, they were going to rebel against them. Clearly, they had a history of fighting with other native tribes. I'm just curious what the priests attempted to do in order to reason with these folks, because it sounds like they were, again, very belligerent towards any outsiders. So Ponce de Leon is back in Florida. He goes ashore around Charlotte Harbor, which is where he was the first time. It's on the Gulf side of Florida, the western side, southwestern part of the state. And if you're looking at a modern day map, it's almost directly in between Sarasota and Fort Myers down there in southwestern Florida. He goes in to Charlotte Harbor and almost immediately engages in conflict with the natives. Let's have a look. He moved forward with his routine and attacked by land and entered into a skirmish or battle with the Indians. So many and such of the enemy charged that his men and his courage did not suffice to withstand them. And finally they defeated him, and he escaped, wounded grievously by an arrow, and he decided to go to the island of Cuba to be cured. So the voyage ends as quickly as it pretty much starts, with disaster. Ponce de Leon returns to Cuba, and shortly thereafter he dies. Juan Ponce de Leon could have avoided this fate had he learned anything from Columbus's experience navigating the Caribbean. Columbus had enough respect for the hostile natives that when he knew somebody was going to be a problem, just like when he first landed in the Bahamas and was told there were problems to the northwest, he did not want to engage them. It seems like Ponce de Leon didn't seem to care. The world theme of conquest, I think, overtook his ambitions, and like General Custer, he charged into an area that he probably thought was a small island with a few hundred natives, and turned out to be in a situation where there were several thousand, and they were completely and utterly overwhelmed. So the question is, will Ponce de Leon's tragedy be a lesson to future explorers? Who is going to come about and try to colonize Florida? Well, this does not stop the Spanish. We will continue the 16th century exploration of the lower 48 states next time on Historical Context.